Hello, my name is Michael Alberg-Seberich and from Wieder Sense, and I will be your facilitator today at this panel discussion. And the panel discussion was the title International Trends in Philanthropy and Their Effects on Foundations in Germany, is part of the Berliner Stiftungswoche. And since the recording will directly jump into the panel discussion, I at least want to introduce one more time the panelists. And the first panelist is Hilary Pearson, who is an author and consultant based in Montreal in Canada. And she's also long-term head of Philanthropic Foundations Canada, and right now is also the co-chair of a commission on charity issues that advises the Canadian government. In addition, on the panel is Erin Ganju, who is right now the Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Robert Bosch Foundation, and she, in her life not in Berlin, is the managing director of Echidna Giving in San Francisco, and she's a former CEO and also co-founder of the social enterprise Room to Read. Then we have two additional members on the panel. One is Dr. Rolf Alter, who is the project lead of Philanthropy.Insight at the Mäzenata Institute. And last but not least, Timo Unger, who is part of the project team of Philanthropy.Insight at the Mäzenata Institute. So enjoy this very lively discussion, and hopefully if you have any questions, just get back to us at Mäzenata or Wieder Sense.
It's important work, which might be helpful and interesting for the rest of the world. So this is in the area of working with Indigenous communities. And for many foundations in Canada, particularly in the West, where there are very large Indigenous communities, both urban and non-urban, the importance of the work of reconciliation and decolonization has become much more central, especially since 2015. So we had an event in 2015 with a report of something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which reported on the terrible, terrible events of the residential school system, which lasted for almost 100 years in Canada. And at that point, the philanthropic community made a declaration of action to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 2015. And that really has galvanized philanthropic activity. There's still far to go. But over the last 2 years, there's been really a heightened awareness and interest in focusing more on reconciliation work with Indigenous people in a way that was unheard of, honestly, before 2010. So that's something we could explore in the questions. I talk in the book about the work of foundations under 7 themes. So, and I illustrate in their work the way in which they're contributing to these themes. And I think these are also things that foundations do in Europe and certainly do in the United States. Building fields, strengthening community, shifting power, advancing public policy, confronting climate change, partnering for impact, and building new relationships with Indigenous peoples. Although I think that last one is one that is distinctive to Canada. And in each case, I've used the foundation stories to illustrate not only the value that is being contributed, but also the ways in which they have grappled with the pressures, both internal and external, to be more responsive, more flexible in their strategies and behaviors. And I think this is also true in Europe, and we're seeing it particularly since the pandemic.
Perfect.
So,
Hilary, now I have to be the bad guy.
Yeah, I figured. See?
No, but I think especially with your categorization, that is something that our next two panelists can really also relate to and connect that with their project on what they called Philanthropy.Insight. And therefore, before we go there, are there any questions of understanding out of the listeners, the audience to Hilary? And Roswitha Meyer already raised her hand. Here we go.
Okay.
Yes, thank you so much. I want only to ask for the title of your book. Can you give it?
Yes, it's From Charity to Change. From Charity to Change. I'm trying to talk about the evolution. From Charity to Change, subtitle Inside the World of Canadian Foundations. It's going to be published by a university press, McGill Queen's University Press, and it should be out this fall. They tell me.
I just posted Hilary's blog webpage, and I'm pretty sure you will find the information there also then. Okay.
You know, I haven't actually updated it yet, Michael.
Well,
I'm waiting for my publication date, but you know, I should just go ahead and put it in there anyway, say it's coming. Yeah.
Okay. Erin?
I just had one question, Hilary. I love this idea of the giraffes and the dolphins and sort of the, not just the imaging, but, you know, sort of the differentiation. I'm curious if you have a sense how many, you know, in Canada fit into which category, roughly? Mm-hmm. Like, is it, you know, 10% that are dolphins? Is it 60% now? Like, what do you see as the, you know, in broad brushstrokes, the range there? And maybe there's even, you know, more subtle sort of differentiation in between the two, I'm assuming, you know, as well. But I'm just curious where you see the, you know, kind of the context now in Canada.
Yeah. And, you know, I think the answer is going to be similar in Canada and in the United States. Yeah. So there are, if you look at it just numerically, and I hate to do that actually, because I don't think that is as telling as looking at it in a different way. You could look at it by assets, you know, are the larger foundations dolphins and the smaller foundations giraffes? Yes. You know, I mean, broadly speaking, and our distribution in Canada of foundations, private foundations, is very similar to the US. So we've got a pyramid with a very wide base, very, you know, a large number of those 6,000 foundations are very small, you know, under 5 million in assets. And you probably would put them all in the giraffe category. Not all, but, you know, most of them. Then you've got this handful of foundations at the top of the pyramid, and they're larger in terms of assets. We don't have the kind of, you know, huge foundations that the United States has, but we have some, and it's growing. And the growth rate in the first 20 years of this century has been quite startling. I mean, a kind of straight line up in terms of numbers of private foundations being created, partly due to tax incentives that the federal government introduced in the late 90s, which has had a significant effect. And also, of course, you know, the markets and how buoyant they've been over this 20 years. We may see a leveling off actually over the next 10 years. But to answer that question around dolphins, you know, I think probably the 20 foundations that I've profiled in my book are the dolphins. You know, you might include another 20 or 40 perhaps in that category. They're important as models though. And I think that's why I wanted to profile them, you know, because to tell their story is to show the others that it's possible to do much more than they're doing, to be much more than grant makers, to be much more than arm's length funders, you know, and sort of uninvolved, unengaged, and also very opaque. And that's true of a lot of foundations.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm pretty sure the metaphor with the dolphins and the giraffes will stay, and maybe in the end we have some kind of a zoo when we talk about foundations, so that could be interesting. But we're now going to explore together with Dr. Rolf Alter and Timo Unger the meaning of trust and collaboration for philanthropy based on their experiences and their work in the Philanthropy.Insight project. So I'm going to hand it to you, Rolf and Timo. The floor is yours.
Yeah, first of all, Michael, thank you very much. I will not introduce another animal right here, maybe later. I don't know what Rolf has in his mind, but I will not introduce another animal. We will speak about trust and philanthropy. And I think a first relevant question would be to ask, why is trust actually important? And we think that, generally speaking, trust is a central element for the functioning of open societies. And we saw that the public sector has understood that it's a critical value, that it's important to look at levels of trust. In part, the business has also understood it. And we can say that trust is actually the license to operate for many nonprofits. But we think it's also very relevant to philanthropies with regard to their impact, but also in their role as a trusted partner. What just was said by Hilary is that they work very often in partnerships, and for that, trust is obviously a very important category. But what we want to mention is that trust is a super complex and multidimensional concept. It can be neither induced nor can it be easily described. So I think what we have to do right here is make sense what are we talking about when we talk about trust? And I will try to be as concise as possible to boil it down, so to say, with using our concept. So I think the first thing that we have to do is apply a little differentiation that is often made in the literature when looking at trust. First of all, is trust in intentions. So do I trust the intention of a philanthropic organization? And the second thing is trust in competence. Do I believe or do I trust the competence of a philanthropic organization to be capable of delivering what it seeks to deliver? So these kind of two forms of trust and competence, trust and intentions, are very important when looking at the concept of trust. And a second thing, as I said, trust is very multidimensional. Why not look at dimensions that are relevant to the philanthropic sector? And this is what we did. First, there is a dimension that could be described as trust within philanthropic organizations. That means trust among staff, between operating levels, managing levels. And I think these relationships are quite important to really start with trust and philanthropy within a philanthropic organization. A second dimension could be trust within the ecosystem of philanthropy. That means trust between philanthropies and other philanthropies, but also between philanthropies and nonprofit organizations that are somehow also in the ecosystem of the philanthropic ecosystem. And we should not forget them, the beneficiaries, which are also within the philanthropic ecosystem. And I think this form of trust is different than the other form of trust that I've just described. And another point is the trust beyond the philanthropic ecosystem. What could that be? This could be trust between philanthropic organizations and business, trust between philanthropic organizations and the public sector. And what is really important here is trust between philanthropic organizations and the public at large, because we don't have much data on general levels of trust, but there are some which are better or not so good, so to say, but they indicate that there are changing levels of trust between philanthropies and the public at large. So, and if we put that together, if we take the trust and competence, trust and intentions, and the trust within organizations, trust within the philanthropic ecosystem, and trust beyond the philanthropic ecosystem, we get a very interesting grid that we can look up when asking ourselves the questions, what is it actually with trust and philanthropies? And from here, we said, well, there are 5 principles, not sufficient, but I think we have found 5 principles that are very important when looking at trust and when looking at the grid that I've just tried to concisely explain. And these 5 principles are at the core of the Philanthropy.Insight project that we have started in 2019. And what are these 5 principles? First of all, commitment by a philanthropic organization, the public purpose, the relevance, performance, and accountability. And with that, I leave it and hand over to Rolf, who will go on at this point.
Yeah, thank you very much, Timo, and thank you very much, Michael, for inviting all of us. I think it's wonderful to see that the Deutsche Stiftungstage also take a bit of a wider perspective and look at what's happening elsewhere. Thank you very much, Hilary, for first insights into the Canadian situation. And I will come back to you because I think you made, in fact, as Michael was saying, some very important remarks on what it is, what we see, not just animals, but we see also perhaps categories of performance. So my point here is, you heard it, we have set up these 5 principles that Timo just mentioned. I will spare you all the details just to say that, of course, when you have these very large and high-flying principles, we made, together with quite a number of other players in this field, the effort, or we tried to make sure that we fill these 5 principles with some particular meaning so that there is some agreement on what it could be when we speak about them. In the end, we got to 45 questions. as a way to really take on a self-assessment. Foundations would look at those 45 questions and would hopefully have answers or not to what it means that you are trying to be a trusted organization in the philanthropic space. That's really where we started from, 45 questions, but we did also something that we consider to be extremely important: create a platform for peer exchanges among those institutions that really would believe that trust is not only important, but they also would like to act on it. They may have experiences and good practices, and what better to learn from each other when you are jointly discussing, exchanging, and by that develop a very good set of ways how to improve the trust in all those directions that Timo was just referring to. As I said, I will go into the details of this instrument, but I will make basically two further comments. The first one is, what is our experience for those last nearly 3 years? The first is really, I think, that despite the fact that it is such an important topic, we are convinced that reform will only come from the inside, and it will not come from another list of to-dos, advised to do the following things, and then you are on track to greater trust in the way we would like to look at it. So our point is really reform from the inside, and actually that's what this instrument wants to do. I said self-assessment because I really think that's important, that it's not as far as at least we have learned, or I have learned. I will really speak about my experience here. I do realize that it isn't really the first attitude of foundations to listen to all those people outside. I think it would be very important to implant, to basically, anchor this kind of trust building inside these institutions rather than from the outside. Very important, and I think really something that for the future of this project will be essential to maintain. The second point that I want to make is, yes, we can have rules, but what we need most is changing mindsets. I think changing mindsets is what will make the difference. And actually, when I say that, this is not just an experience in foundations. Actually, when you look at governments, as I said, I was just with a lot of other experts discussing this question. We all have focused on institutions, but the people inside the institutions are, of course, at least as important. So when you want to change something, it should be inside, and it should be at mindset level. It's also about skills, but it's also about attitudes, it's about behaviors, and it's about values. To do that, our project has explicitly addressed itself to leaders, because after all, the tone is set at the top. And I think we have seen it very much in our discussions. Timo could refer to it a little more because he carried out a number of interviews with staff, with people who work in institutions of philanthropy. What did he find? There may be a lot of noise. There may be people who would like to change it. But in the end, there is one person or one board that sets the tone. So I think when we want to make these changes inside, we'll need to bring the leaders together. And here's my last point that I want to make. Hilary was talking about that there is a small number of foundations that could be considered models. I like that. I think exactly that's what it will be necessary to bring models together. And if possible, the leaders of these models to ensure that they, at least from the inside, develop their approach and take this approach then, as a standard setter, not because they have any kind of power to set someone else's standards, but to be convincing just because they do it and they do it successfully. And they make progress in establishing this very, very precious currency of trust. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rolf, and thank you, Timo. And I think it is really important also to know that for your work, you talked with an abundance of international foundations from various countries. So it also brings that in. And there is already a question here. Caroline Wattenberg, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this fascinating input. I was wondering, or I actually have two questions. First, because you just referred to it, and that's also a question to Hilary. Who are those model organizations? Who would you consider in the foundation sector, in the foundation environment as model, as exemplary for the sector? The second question is, my understanding is that you focused on philanthropic organizations. So I was wondering, did you also look at, because you were talking about the wider philanthropic ecosystem, did you also look at high net worth individuals and how that changes trust in philanthropy in general? Because that's something that we definitely see in the United States. People like Mackenzie Scott, really pump a lot of money into that system, and it changes the perception, or at least that's my sense, changes the perception of philanthropy. So did you also factor in those high net worth individuals or just organizations? Thank you.
Well, thank you for your questions. Rolf and Timo, do you want to answer right away? React?
Very quickly, yes. Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. I think when you ask me what I consider models, I could name a few, but this isn't really my purpose here. But I can tell you that the ones that we have worked with, I think one of the most impressive actually was the fact that someone said, we have been now looking at our strategy for the next 5 to 10 years. What is it? How will we position us as a foundation? How will we position us in a world that looks, after the experience, especially of the pandemic, very different? And this idea of crisis, I think we will come back to that, but that idea of crisis of a kind of a different order of magnitude seems to be now with us, and we can see it. I mean, really, I don't know, it's not just our perception. I think it's just the fact that the global crisis, as we just lived through in the pandemic, and we are living still through it, make, of course, that long-term perspective there. My point here is, you see, that foundation said, we need to make sure that our strategy incorporates, from shaping the strategy, the idea that we have to be a trusted partner, come hell or high water. But that's what we need. And I'd say, since it is, as Timo so eloquently pointed out, it is a complex subject. I think you will see practices and experiences very, very clearly emerging. And there will be a quite natural differentiation between the leaders and the followers, or even worse, those who are in neither category, because they are also there, I can assure you. And the second point I want to say, I realize that there are now this type of high net wealth individuals. You see, in a way, I think it makes the idea of our principles even more important. They set standards, but I do think that this also means that it's not just about the giving, it's also about, for example, the type of accountability that has to be there. And I think we need to look at, is it giving away? I know that she's, especially Mrs. Scott McKinsey, I mean, she's giving a lot of money, but I would caution, it's not the amount of money that you give. I think it's the quality of giving that would make the difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Rupert, you also have a question, comment?
Just a comment, or perhaps just to add another word on Caroline's second question. Obviously, we had to start somewhere with this project, and so we focused it on philanthropic institutions to mean foundations all over the world. And you will see in the report that we talked about it in very different circles. We didn't actually focus on high net worth individuals. Perhaps if Mackenzie Scott had started a couple of years earlier, we would have focused on people like that. But definitely the whole project, the questionnaire, everything could be adapted to high net worth individuals with a little effort. We also did test the whole project on other civil society organizations, NGOs, and we found a lot of interest there, and we found that there one could actually adapt it with very, very little effort. I mean, one literally just had to change a bit of the wording, and one could use the same methodology on any not-for-profit organization, foundations, NGOs, what have you. So, I mean, you know, it's now published. Anybody can take it up and use it. If anybody wants to involve us again, yes, thank you. It was a first start. We started from scratch, and so now we can sort of develop it further. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think it is. It's no coincidence, and since in the English language they also use the nice German word of Zeitgeist, trust. It's not surprising that there's trust-based philanthropy, that in Germany we have the initiative Trust Creates Impact. So there's a variety of things that are going on, and that's why it is so cool that from Canada over to an overview, like an overall concept to look at philanthropy, we will now come to somebody who is asking everybody in Germany questions right now about philanthropy, because she's trying to understand how does actually German philanthropy work, and how does it also compare to her experience as being a practitioner in philanthropy in the United States. So Erin, I'm really, really glad that you're here, and we at least already had a couple of very interesting, intense conversations around philanthropy in Germany. So how are you going to look fantastic to look at your outside-in view on Germany, so that we can really now build that bridge over to what do all these trends mean also for the German context. So Erin, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Well, it's intimidating to talk to a number of Germans about something that you know much more about than outsider, but pleasure to reflect back. Foundations, it was a mirror, you know, to them in terms from an outside perspective. So I will try to do justice, synthesize and share back interesting opportunities, as Michael is saying, here at the Bosch Academy, just 6 months doing a dive and understanding the German culture. And I think, as we talked about just from the intro, my personal background is having been a social entrepreneur 20 years in the US, growing and scaling an international education organization, and then growing into for one of our founders that helped scale Read, which comes out of the Google world and is part of the new philanthropy of the US, West and Silicon Valley.
Erin,
Yeah.
Sorry, your connection is really, really bad. Can you, I know it's really mean to somebody who is giving their presentation, but maybe you want to go in and out one more time so that the connection is better.
Okay, that's still right now?
Yeah, I would suggest that we try this
Cool.
right now so that people can really also hear what you have to say, because it's important.
You could also turn off her camera, maybe, Michael.
Yeah, that would be the other solution, but maybe
Does that help at all?
Yeah, that already helps. Yeah. Erin.
Okay. Maybe let me continue so we don't spend much time going out.
No, Erin, this is not working. Just go out one more time and then come in. I mean, there must be something wrong with the connection. Sorry, technology.
I know it has the advantages of, allowing someone like me to participate, although I would love to fly to Berlin. I wish I could be there. It's a long postponed visit, Michael.
Well, you will come at one point, I'm pretty sure. And then we will have then we have an event in Rupert's library, and it will be really cool.
That would be nice.
Okay, poor Erin. So.
Maybe I could make another comment about the high net worth individual, because I liked the question. In many ways, or in many cases, better, you cannot really see the high net worth individual and not think about his vehicle, which is often the foundation. So I think there is also a connection, right? Because in many ways, in many cases, they use foundations as institutions to give. So it's interrelated.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, I actually have a point I wanted to make as well in relation to that, Michael, in answer to the question. Some of the foundations that I have seen in Canada that I think are the most inspiring at this point are not just the foundations that have a clear strategy and who have established goals, which they're communicating. Communication is a challenge for foundations, but it's the foundations that have managed to look internally. And I think this goes to the point made earlier, foundations that are really consciously trying to connect values and culture and behaviors to strategy. Because, strategy is people are not going to trust you. And I'm talking to the trust experts here, but, they're not going to trust you if they don't see your values and your behaviors consistent with your strategy.
Yeah.
And it is a real struggle, I think, for a lot of foundations to do that, to think about that, to figure out how to do that in a way that is believable. And it takes time as well. I'm thinking, Michael, of the foundation well, the Chagnon Foundation in Quebec, which is a very large foundation. It's a $2 billion foundation, which for us in Canada is a big foundation. And they have done a 180-degree turn in terms of how they behave, which is quite remarkable. They operate only in Quebec.
Hilary, we will come back to that, okay?
Yeah. Is she back?
Yeah, Erin made it back.
So sorry. Thank you, Michael, for telling me. Sorry, Hilary. Thank you for keeping the conversation going.
Well, sorry, Erin, but I thought that was better than.
No, I feel quite at home because in Silicon Valley we have the worst internet, so that only serves to keep the tradition going.
Okay, but now it seems to be a really good connection, so it's all on. You can go on. Thank you.
Okay, well, apologize. As I was saying, sort of the bubble that I am in from the West Coast social entrepreneur, new philanthropy to Berlin is, kind of the starting of this was a great opportunity since I'm sitting here to, if you will, interrogate and have interesting conversations within the German foundation sector to understand what does a sector look like? How is it different? How is it the same? What is the discourse, the dialogue, the tensions and trends that are here in Germany? And so several people on today's call have been ones I've been able to spend time with, and it's just been a really interesting opportunity. And so I'll try to summarize. It's hard to summarize, and I'm happy to share out the synthesis I've written up of this for anyone interested afterward. but I had the opportunity to speak to over 40 stakeholders that come out of foundations, part of the ecosystem supporting foundations, from civil society that are raising funds from foundations, as well as some academia and a little bit of government input. So it's been a wide, obviously not a large enough sample size to make huge conclusions, but enough to get a good sense of some trends, I think. And I'll just talk about a few things that have surprised me through that, and that may be interesting to talk about more and relate actually a lot to the Philanthropy.Insight work and to what Hilary's raising today too. I mean, first, I think it was hard to get Germans to talk about something that was positive in their sector. That could be, as many have explained to me, partly cultural, just in terms of wanting to talk about all the things that may be wrong or problem solve rather than kind of celebrate what might be there. But I think there's something to it as well to say that there's a lot of frustration is a way maybe to summarize it as well. Frustration and self-critique and from within the sector, which I think is good and healthy, as Rolf is talking about, because reimagining philanthropy does start from within, hopefully, but also quite strong critique from the NGO sector, dealing and interacting with the philanthropy foundation sector. And that I don't think is necessarily very constructive to obviously being aligned and achieving our joint goals. There was a lot of discussion about how there just wasn't enough money here to really have it matter that much, which again, I think it's sort of a false narrative, because when you really look at some of it, the sector, first of all, it is the second largest foundation sector in the world to the US by just number of foundations, not to say all of them are large ones. And Hilary, similar to what you were saying, that a lot of small foundations that are pretty traditional and family run, but still it's a large enough sector that we should care how it interacts publicly and what the image is, what the trust is, with the sector. And in terms of assets, it's actually quite large. I think the Philanthropy.Insight report also highlighted the Global Philanthropy report that shows that it's the third largest in terms of resources after the US and Netherlands at 92 billion. So that's money that we don't really want to leave on the table if we're in crisis. If our house is burning down, we might want to think about spending some of that money, not keeping it on the sidelines. And in terms of cross-border gain, Germany also is the fourth largest, according to the Lilly Family School, behind the US, the UK, and Canada. So again, it's an important sector that we should understand what it's doing and how it can be best serving our needs. I think that the frustration that has built up is into the very traditional sort of legal, tax, cultural practices that have predominated in the German foundation sector. And I think what's challenging about that is I heard a lot about people wanting to change things, but very few wanting to take a leadership role in that. Again, to that point that I think we're all talking about is who are those key leaders that can be great models in foundations, both the foundations themselves as well as the leaders in them. And for historical and cultural reasons, again, there was a sense of hesitancy to sort of step out and lead, either within the German foundation sector and advocate for more change within your own legal and tax structure, or in a European global perspective and be a stronger global leader in terms of I think what are actually really important models that are working in Germany. I mean, there is a social welfare economy that happens to be in my own failed experiment coming out of the US of what democracy looks like. I think are important to really understand and similar to what you're saying, Hilary, and the kind of the what the roles of foundations are. I think it's very interesting to look at what that can look like in a social welfare economy that is very different than the Anglo-Saxon model. And I think that's something that we could look at more deeply in Germany. But it takes leadership. It takes people understanding that, contextualizing it, being able to promote, if I use an American word, to go out and talk about it. And that's again something that there's a lot of hesitancy to. And so when I think of that, I think one of the challenges is how do you develop that coalition of the willing? How do you develop that leadership that could come together? I think one thing that just offer a few points of what I think could be interesting to pay attention to within the conversations I had is one, it was very important for people to understand and have more transparency just on the sector, any part of the sector. I mean, what foundations are doing, who they're giving to, how much they're giving, what nonprofits are doing. There are no real rankings like you see in Charity Navigator or other systems that exist out there in larger markets like the US or the UK. So that transparency was super important to everyone. I think that is actually important, but I don't think it's sufficient. I think the second point I would make is that what made made Germans really uncomfortable in these conversations, it seemed to be, was talking about power dynamics and relationship dynamics. And that's where I would ask a question and we'd go back to the transparency and the data and the budgets and I'd ask about the relationship again, and we'd shift away. And it was just really hard to have those conversations. I think when you talk, Hilary, about sort of, decolonization and much of the movement that is now happening around understanding our power that we hold and what that means in terms of trust-based philanthropy, as a Philanthropy.Insight project has talked about, it's we have to be able to talk about it. I mean, in some ways, I think of it, it's like being an alcoholic, right? You have to admit that there's a problem before you can actually try to find ways to solve it. And I think in many ways in philanthropy, we're maybe not so great at being able to sort of self-reflect and admit what some of our issues are in order to go deeper and start to address them. I think the other one that was interesting is that it was very challenging to find any foundations or parts of the ecosystem that really found ways to develop hearing from grantees, or the listening factor that's so important in trust-based and kind of reimagining philanthropy. That was something that was just, sort of like, well, a little bit of the why would we do that? We already know what people are saying, and it was like, well, do you really know how often do you ask those questions? How do you ask them anonymously where you get real feedback and not just sort of grantees wanting to tell you all the good things, but how do you actually get constructive feedback in order to do your job better? We all need constructive feedback, and where do you get that? And that was something that was, again, a difficult conversation. And then finally, I would land on the diversity piece. That was also one that came up often, in Reimagine Philanthropy, and talking about needing a diverse set of people around the table. I'm not just talking about necessarily ethnic or racial diversity. Even gender diversity was not as high as I expected in Germany. It certainly, different life experience, migration, or different socioeconomic perspectives, age, even younger, newer ideas often come from our younger population. Innovations, ideas around just switching industries, nonprofit folks working in foundations, foundation folks working in nonprofits, much less other industries. All of that was much less seen, and I think what was people responded, and when I asked questions around that, much more around thinking of it as, well, should we do that because we have to do it? Not so much from the position of we want to do that because we value what that diversity might bring us in our own decision making, our own understanding. And so I think, again, like Rolf, totally agree with you. If it's a check the box, something external pressure, that's not going to necessarily move the dial. And so how do we have some of these conversations internally in order to understand what that means to us? And so it left me with a lot of good food for thought around trying to understand what is the real reformist movement. There's a burgeoning, starting, as we've talked about, with Trust Creates Impact and Impulse Stiftung, which is a great, sort of movement. I think Felix is here today. Great movement of staff in foundations wanting to kind of push the envelope and learn more broadly. Some good, initiatives that have started here, but it seems very, nascent, I think, in terms of the reformist movement, lacking in leadership from maybe some of the bigger foundations that could put more, oomph to the reformist movement, and a lack of real vision of what that even really means for the German foundation sector. And I think that's, as I said, the missing link there is, I think the world needs more of us all from different contexts and country contexts, and certainly a European perspective added to the global development agenda, and understanding, where our world is going and how to get there. And so I think there's a real need for German leadership, given the large size of the economy and the influence that Germany has as a global player. And I think philanthropy and private philanthropy can help play an important role in that, but it does need some leadership and a vision. So I'll end with that and hand it back to you, Michael.
Thank you, Erin. That was a lot of food for thought. And there is already a first question, comment. So any questions towards Erin? Rolf, do you want to start?
Thank you very much, Erin, and thank you very much. It confirms really, it takes an outsider to have an inside view. Thank you so much. And I'm pretty sure that many of the things that you said will be not only food for thought for yourself, but I hope really it will also be food for thought for the people who are actors in the German foundation system. One thing I'd like to really come back what you said about diversity. You know, I think it's so obvious, but if you want to make sure that you have contacts, that you have programs, let me put it this way, that you have programs, activities, spending for people, the minimum is that you have a conversation with these people, whether it's what you think is the right analysis and whether the way to respond are the right means. And I think your point about diversity, of course, it has to do with the grantees issues as well. But I do think that I really would wonder what you said, what you would say about it. Diversity means bringing these kinds of people in the system rather than looking at them as objects of your activity. Perhaps you may want to comment there for a moment, because I do really think, you know, I'm very much always concerned when governments make these great decisions about what's good for people. I wonder whether they have actually also tried to make sure that they understand what these people are and want. So it's not only a foundation issue, certainly not.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, Rolf. And I think it's certainly not only a German, foundation sector issue. So I don't mean to imply that at all, because I would say it's pretty across the board. It's an issue. And I think what I have, also coming out of it from the nonprofit sector and having fundraised, for many more years now than I've been in the philanthropic sector, I think it also, it does come from these power dynamics, that we see, and it comes from wanting to have things fit into nice boxes and charts and budgets that we can feel more comfortable and control over. So it doesn't always necessarily come from a negative place, but I think it comes from a lack of understanding of what impact and what, of how to actually value the change that we're trying to create. It comes from, not valuing lived experience, how proximate people are to the issues, the complexity of the issues, and things that doesn't always fit into the right sort of measurement and evaluation and budget type of formats that we love to lean against in philanthropy. And so I've definitely, as in Echidna Giving in our world that we work in, now that I have been in philanthropy for a few years, have just realized that honestly I could almost care less what a report says at one level. I mean, it's important as a starting to a conversation, but there's so much more deeper value by talking to people that are working in and both the programs as well as the others that are being involved in the programs. So much more richness in that you can never get from from a simple chart. And I think that's something that we just have to learn different ways of dealing with in philanthropy, because it really is holding us back, I would say, in many ways.
Erin, and it looks like the panelists have a discussion within themselves, but Hilary and then Vincent.
Well, I mean, there's just so much to talk about, right? But I wanted to contribute an insight that, I've really only come to in the last year or so. I'm still learning so much about this, but I actually think in relation to our work on reconciliation with Indigenous people, this is actually accelerating our understanding. And when I say our, I mean the philanthropic community in Canada, our understanding of the need to think about power, to think about listening, to think about trust. And the interesting thing about working with Indigenous people is that when you talk to communities, you realize that they're not looking at it as shifting power, because they have their own power.
Yeah.
They have so much to give us. For them, this is an exchange. It's not, us versus you, or, a zero sum kind of thing. It's more, we have knowledge, we have assets, that are not financial assets, perhaps, but they are deep understanding of our natural environment and a whole cultural worldview that is so valuable to share. And when the admittedly very white philanthropic community in Canada, and this is a foundation community, engages in more of this conversation with Indigenous people, then you find a kind of a huge shift, a mindset shift happening, within the white population, not so much in the Indigenous. They're teaching us, and they have a lot to teach us. Yeah. And I think we have a lot that we are learning now about our blind spots and about what we didn't know and what we should be thinking about, which is going to the point made earlier about the importance of changing a mindset. It's not simply about giving more money. I mean, I think there's a very unnuanced, very political conversation going on in Canada, as it is in the United States, about handing money over to communities that are marginalized and often racialized. So there is a color distinction that's made. You white people give to us, Black and brown people, because you need to do that. And you need to sort of hand the power over. That's not the way people in Indigenous communities talk at all, and I have to say I'm struck by the value that we're getting from this conversation that I don't think any of us expected to get, all of which it makes us sound more virtuous than we are. Believe me, there is so much further that we have to go, but I do think it's something that we can talk about more and maybe share more with the philanthropic community globally.
Yeah, I think that's great, Hilary. And it's really that movement from the transactional to, the relationship building, which exactly. I think is yes, something that is we're big proponents of too. Yeah. Vincent, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. First of all, thanks for these inputs. Very interesting. I'm wondering whether we shouldn't be more radical about our ambitions here. So I heard Rolf saying, well, we need to change in the inside, it needs to be on the mindset level. We talked about role models, people at the top in foundations, leading the change. I'm totally with that. We said transparency is important, but I'm wondering a bit about the time frame here. So are we speaking then about, generations that we'll have to wait for? Because I think the boards do set the tone, definitely, but I don't see a lot of movement there, to be honest. Imagine half of the boards were under 25. I think this would be a disruption, but I don't see that coming. So can we create other disruptions? Where is the potential for disruptions? Because I feel we shouldn't be waiting for some of these changes to somehow arrive at some point. And Erin, you mentioned that external pressure maybe doesn't move it, but I do wonder. I mean, imagine, there was a Bild Zeitung, a yellow press on philanthropy. There would be crazy stories portrayed there, and I think a lot of, especially the big foundations, they are sensitive to public pressure. I mean, we don't have that, but I'm just trying to be creative about, what could be there to advance that change a little faster. But maybe you have other ideas as well. I'm just wondering what's out there.
Yeah, maybe
I could Erin, start with a couple recommendations that I did land on, and I think it's a great point, because I think it's trying to develop solutions is always better than just talking about the problems. One of the things I sensed a lot in Germany was the need for more public education around civil society, the value of it, both from nonprofit implementing type of organizations as well as foundations. To your point of just having there be more of a understanding and a dialogue and a discourse around it. Again, strong social welfare economy. There's a lot of reasons why that hasn't happened, that you don't need it in some ways, but I think there's now a missed opportunity and a cost to not having a larger, kind of public discourse that, because of the wealth that is created and is growing in Germany, that will be in the hands of individuals to be able to give back, that needs to be, tackled in a different way. And I think the media attention is an interesting one, because in some ways it can be used as a positive or negative force. And in some ways, I think there's a lot of healthy kind of questions around legitimacy of how wealth was earned. And again, historically, don't need to explain to anyone here, why that has happened. But I think the problem is that sometimes now there is such a fear of the media going after you. You know, if you are wealthy, if you talk about where where you're giving, that it also has again a sort of a backlash where you want to celebrate. In Defense of Philanthropy is a book that sort of talks about how we sometimes overly criticize philanthropy to the point where then you're not encouraging families to be more transparent, or foundations to be more transparent, and to celebrate the positive nature of what we can do on the margins of what can be giving back and doing good. So I think it's a good thing to talk about more, is the role of media, the role of the public pressure, how to use it, and in what ways can we engage with it more.
Thank you, Erin. Then Timo also raised his hand, and then
it's actually a reaction to Vincent's, because I think he's absolutely right with what he says. But in the end, it leads to a certain accountability deficit that is within the philanthropic ecosystem. Because if you look at for example, at the public sector, you have, so to say, at least in liberal democracies, you have elections, and they create some sort of accountability. In the business sector, you have shareholder value that creates some kind of accountability. But I think there's a lack of mechanism here with regard to accountability in the philanthropic sector. And where should it come from? Okay, one could argue government, hard rod of regulation, but it's not so interesting for them to do that. And I think a way to do it is that it comes out of the system, that some leaders decide to create something different, that they create another culture. And I think this is what might need to happen.
Thank you. Caroline Wattenberg, please.
Thank you, and thank you, Erin. I was wondering, Hilary said that one of the roles of foundations is also co-creation, so activism, advocacy. And I was just wondering, since you were saying that, and there is obviously a lot of hesitancy among German foundations, and I'm speaking for my own organization, to do advocacy and to do more activism. So do you think the reason is exactly what you were saying in response to Vincent's, that it's because of that fear of negative press, of public pressure, or what is the reason for that hesitancy, and how can we maybe, get rid of it?
Well, this is a topic near and dear to my heart. I think that the last thing that I did before I left the network that I ran, Philanthropic Foundations Canada, was to write what I called a guide to public policy work, with exactly this goal of encouraging foundations to be more engaged and to perhaps not be advocates. I think there's been a confusion actually in Canada. I don't know about Germany, but in Canada, the assumption made by a lot of foundations is if you're going to be involved in public policy, that means you're advocating, that you're out there taking a position, and that could be seen as political or partisan. And well, that's not our job. That's not what we do. But in fact, there's a whole spectrum, a continuum actually in the policy development sphere. And when I think of advocacy, I am thinking of policy development, public policy development. And foundations can occupy a very important role in supporting the development of policy options, which can then be advocated for by organizations that have an explicit advocacy purpose. So, a partnership between foundations that might support research, or might support convening, or might support a social change lab of some kind. Labs have become very popular in Canada, where you bring people together around a table and you work out some policy options, which you can then present to government, and government, will make the decisions that it makes. I will say that I think one big gap that we have in the foundation world in Canada is we have not supported the infrastructure for advocacy. So the intermediary organizations, the umbrella organizations that are out there speaking on behalf of groups of nonprofits, groups of charities, we have an extremely weak infrastructure, and it's been very poorly funded. And I don't understand this, because I think the leverage of supporting these kinds of infrastructure organizations is huge. A foundation with relatively little money can actually support a policy development process that is going to have major impact on the sector across Canada. We have something like 86,000 charities why not support the national umbrella organizations that do this work? Mackenzie Scott, interestingly, and when she was giving out another one of her huge chunks of money, gave a significant amount of money to infrastructure organizations. And that may have been on the advice of Bridgespan, which seems to be her kind of consultant of choice. But I think it was a very significant move. And I'd love to see other foundations doing that. You know, that is advocacy work, but it doesn't mean that the foundation itself has to be front and center. You know, I think if you support the advocates, you are supporting advocacy. So, you know, I think that is something that we just need to keep on educating the foundation world around. And, you know, I think foundations have struggled, and maybe this is a comment that goes back to some of the earlier conversation and certainly to Erin's insights, you know, and by the way, Erin, you know, if you had this conversation in Canada, you'd be having all the same insights. It's like the same stuff here. I don't know whether it's cultural or what, but, you know, foundations have this reticence to talk about themselves and to come out and be visible. And it's not only because media might attack them. It's not only because, you know, they don't like to be visible because of criticism. There's actually an internal reluctance, you know, a kind of, well, we don't talk about that. You know, we don't talk about having money. We don't talk about spending money or giving it away. You know, like it's not about us, which is Canadian, but not really American. I have to say, Americans, it's all about us. You know, you'd love to have your name all over the place.
And we love to talk about money.
Yeah, money's a good thing. Like, it's good to make money. It's, you know, people are admired when they make money, right? Not in Canada. We have that sort of Protestant Anglo-Saxon thing going on, you know, that is sort of like, oh no, you don't talk about that, you know. And I mean, and the worst part of that is you look at the others, and when they say anything about themselves, you go, ooh, they're saying way too much about themselves, you know, like, who do they think they are anyway? Who do they think they are? It's like incredibly frustrating.
So Hilary, the moment you talked about public policy, Max von Abendroth came in from Philea, so it's perfect timing. Okay. So, but Rupert was next.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to add a couple of points picking up on what Erin was saying, what other people have just been saying. I think one thing about Germany is that Germans still tend to be fairly deferential towards governments. This has, I mean, we had a man called Hegel 200 years ago who defined government as being on top of everything. And he said government by definition could never be wrong. And this is somehow still in many people's blood here, in many people's mindset, as Rolf said. And I think that is something that needs to be overcome in a way. The other thing is, in foundations, we now see quite a lot of change-mindedness with junior and senior sort of people at the working level in philanthropic institutions. But when it comes to the actual decision makers, boards, managing directors, we often find complete amateurs who've come in from some other job in business or somewhere, who have adopted a sort of, you know, final decision-making attitude. Once I have spoken, everybody else has to obey. And they get their knowledge on civil society, on policy matters, on things like that from, I don't know where, from the papers or something. But anyway, they're not trained for that, and they're not willing to have themselves be trained. So we get a lot of very odd decisions taken, although program officers, staff members have actually made very good proposals. And that is, I think, a real bad point that we have to admit exists in German philanthropy.
Thank you. Okay, Rolf.
Thank you. Very briefly, Caroline was sort of saying this idea about advocacy. You see, I do think we perhaps should really come from another angle. I'd say if you're an important fish in the pond, and some are very much so. I mean, we have heard it, no? These very few at the top and many at the base. There is just a lot of power allocated to this part of the philanthropic sectors. And I do think that it means when you want to play in this context or in this space, it comes with it that just the enormous potential that you have, and you make it happen and apply somewhere, that would come with responsibilities that go beyond an annual report, which will be then probably stay with a very few people. I like the idea about education. I think if people don't know exactly what it is, they will be suspicious simply. And my last comment here is simply, Erin said it so nicely, you know, there isn't something wrong if you're saying we are a very financially strong institution that can, and we will want to make sure they can do, and we want to make sure that we can actually do it in the right way, especially when you think about the crisis situation. I find it would be really perceived to be, I'm sure, to be fantastic that foundations come out and say, well, really here, there's something, and we invite a few people, and then we'll decide on where we want to go. Of course, the decision remains with the people. There's no doubt about it. But this would be at least something which is a bit more evidence-based and rather not so much that comes out of somewhere in the perceptions. I think there is a difference to be made. And if you want to be a big player, I think it would be useful to believe that even for them, evidence is something that counts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rolf. Erin, what did you do to this whole panel? Everybody is like up and going. I just wanted to point out one more time, because most of these questions, and just as an insight that I find very interesting, there are two German researchers, Pascal Göske and Evelyn Moser at the University of Bonn, who have written this really interesting explorative paper called Transformative Foundations, Elements of a Sociological Theory of Organized Philanthropic Giving. Sounds very complicated, very nerdy, but it's I think it is exactly one of the other things that is really, really missing is the theory around foundation as an organization. And it's really interesting that suddenly also sociologists are looking at this a little bit more in detail. And it's in combination with projects like Philanthropy.Insight and so on, because we still are struggling also with the concepts around this, no matter what. And I know with Rupert, you can have long discussions about this because he definitely has looked into this field for a long, long time. But nevertheless, but Erin, do you want to react one more time?
Yeah, no, there's so much, and just on that last point, I do think it's was interesting to me, even, asking a lot of questions. It made me think, even in the US, there's so many different variations of what we think of foundations and who are we and what roles do we play. But certainly I found that very challenging in Germany to nail down. Everyone kind of had their own different definition of what qualified and what the role was and how it should be best put to use. So I think they're also, to that point on advocacy, I find it really interesting, the point you made about the infrastructure investment for it, Hilary, because I do think the best way that foundations can be supportive of us in some ways is to support from behind and to support our, the grantees and the associations in various ways in which they can be empowered, in vehicles. And it's very hard for them to get funding. I mean, you talk to any of those organizations that are in that role, they almost have zero funding because everybody likes the idea of counting, very specific beneficiaries and very direct impact, right? And so we miss huge opportunities to have greater leverage. And I think, a lot of that is almost non-existent in Germany, to be honest. And so I think that is an interesting place as well in terms of thinking about how do we get, how do we support, to the point of foundations maybe not wanting to be out in front and being, too highly, sort of sticking your head up and being the one that gets your head chopped off. There are other ways to structure, collaborating and coalitions that I think would be really interesting to think about and when driving for change. And I think, just on the point of what I did really see and value, in Germany again, is that I think there is a huge desire for change. And I think what sometimes we don't maybe give ourselves enough credit for, and maybe I'm going to be very American here and try to be rallying and aspirational and inspirational, but I do think there is this piece where people look to philanthropy, they want to see a vision, they want to see support, they want to see you, being able to celebrate the great work. And I think there's an element of being able, of us not doing that so well sometimes in philanthropy, because again, for all those reasons, we want to be behind the scenes, we don't want to be given too much credit, we don't want to be we don't want to talk about where the money comes from. All those things are real, and I'm not saying celebrate philanthropy itself, but I'm saying celebrate the work. If we're really mission aligned with the work that we're trying to achieve, important things around poverty alleviation and climate crisis and so many of the inequities that we all are addressing and struggling with, if we are trying to save, some form of a, liberal democracy, I mean, there are things that we need to be able to be comfortable trying to say our values that we're trying to promote and support. And I think that's something that we don't think enough about. And so it's a different angle of advocacy, but it's not just a policy change, but it's also just understanding the work that needs to be done and how we can be supportive of it and what we need to do, because there are so many people. Definitely the next generation, has a lot of different ideas. And I'll just end on that point, which is, I so many conversations ended in Germany with people almost just feeling like the foundation sector was irrelevant and we might as well just go somewhere else, do something else, start all sorts of new impact, investment and hybrid models. And, I can tell you from the last 20 years of seeing all that happen in Silicon Valley, it didn't get us very much further than where we are today. You pretty much just reinvent the same problem somewhere else. And it is, again, the mindset change, as we're saying, we have to deal with the mindset change, because a new vehicle, a new legal entity, a new hybrid, call it whatever you want, is not going to solve, the problems that are, again, much more relationship and mindset based.
Okay, thank you very much. And Mrs. Meyer put in a quote in the chat that underlines that one more time, good old Rocky musician quotation. So that is also of help. Are there, from the audience, do you have any other questions towards the panelists? I'm also aware of time, and I really want to make sure that you also get an opportunity to ask your questions. Maybe there is something else that you still want to know from our panelists. Yes, Max, welcome.
Yeah. Great to be here and sorry for being late. So obviously I can't really reflect now to the whole discussion, but just the last element I picked up, and because of the work that I'm doing at European level in the advocacy field vis-a-vis the EU institutions, wanted to comment on, and then I also have a question. Commenting on the fact that the advocacy work is taking place in two areas. One is around the enabling environment for philanthropy. So that's really shaping the fiscal policies around philanthropy. And the other one is more related to the thematic work. So let's say climate, social injustice, and so on. And I observe that these are two very different things. So while on the latter, the foundations are actually not that hesitant to engage with public authorities. On the first one, that's much more difficult, and infrastructure has to play a more important role. And I can see that in this field, even there is an appetite to get funding from public sources to fund the advocacy work on behalf of the philanthropy sector, which I'm personally not a big fan of, but it's just an observation. Wings just got an enormous funding from the European Commission to build up the advocacy work of philanthropy across the world. My question is to the panelists, do you share the view that there's an increased appetite from public authorities to enter into public-private partnership relationships with the foundation sector, as we can currently see that at the EU level? Thank you.
Thank you, Max. That's a really good question because it goes actually also into the direction with also Rolf's experience with international organizations and also the question of how does that play out with relationships. But Hilary, maybe you want to start because you're at the heart right now of that question in your commission in Ottawa.
Yes, and the short answer is no. I don't think governments are pursuing public-private partnerships with philanthropy, partly because governments don't really understand philanthropy in Canada. And we know why. We've talked about it already. There isn't enough information. Foundations themselves don't talk enough about themselves. In spite of all the communication efforts that I undertook over 20 years, at Philanthropic Foundations Canada, governments are still drawing a blank when it comes to philanthropy in Canada. So they miss the opportunity. They don't see it. It's not clear to them. But the second reason, I think, is unfortunately a more negative one. And it's that the policy framework, and I'm speaking broadly now about sort of the framework for philanthropy, not the individual subject matter areas, because actually, you've made a good distinction, I think. The subject matter areas, such as climate, in particular climate in Canada, is an area where certain government people are seeing the advantages of working with certain nonprofit sector players, which include foundations. And there are some foundations in Canada that have taken a lead role in helping to build new policy options for net zero emissions and reaching our net zero goals. So setting that aside, I think the issue is more, what in general does government think the role of philanthropy is and the role of charities as funders? And I think on that, unfortunately, our policy framework is shaped by a thinking that is dominated by our Department of Finance and by our tax people. And it is, to me, an extremely unfortunate situation that we have, that the tax policy people of the Department of Finance, through our income tax system and the fact that charities are able to give tax receipts to donors, that's their entry point. That's why, we have a whole superstructure of regulation and rules for charities in Canada based on that one entry point. It's not a statutory. We have no Charities Act in Canada. We have no statutory framework that defines charity. And we do not have an independent charities commission. It's all done through the Department of Finance and our Canada Revenue Agency. And of course, their perspective, naturally, is how do we protect the fisc? How do we protect our revenue base? How do we limit the opportunities that taxpayers have to escape paying tax? And if we are in fact conferring a benefit on charities by allowing them to issue tax receipts, and therefore the public is foregoing revenue that could otherwise be used for public distribution, then we are going to make sure that charities behave charitably. And their definition of what is charitable is a very narrow one. And we can't advance it through the courts. This would be the other avenue, that we would, through legal action, that we would be able to progress the common law definition of charity. And we can't do that either, for reasons I won't go into in detail because you'd all be bored. But it is a very frustrating situation in which we are almost frozen in place in Canada in this whole question of the definition of charity. That's the work partly of the commission that I am co-chairing right now, but we're not making much headway. And I feel that there's going to have to be some major fracture, some major challenge, some major break that is going to get us out of this straitjacket that we're in. So we're working at the margins. We work. There is, and Michael's going to tell me to stop talking because I could. Yeah, I know. I could go on. I mean, this is very important to me.
I know you, and you can talk about this for hours. I know.
A little edge there, isn't there? Yeah. Okay. All right. I'll stop there. But I talk about this in my book too.
Yeah. So, but definitely, and I know how passionate you are about it. If not, Max will also find the way to talk to you also in person one more time about this. So Rupert, you're next, and then I have Timo.
Yeah, I'm not a panelist, but I'm itching to sort of answer Max's question, and I would agree with Hilary totally in saying no. This may have been true 20 years ago. There was a time, and we can see this in legal reforms that the government got done 20 years ago. There was a time when governments were indeed seeking public-private partnerships because they were running out of funding, and they seriously believed foundation funding, philanthropic funding could pay for government tasks in a meaningful way. This is over with. Today, besides the arguments that Hilary had, I would argue that governments are terrified of being pushed out of the driver's seat. And so they're trying to crowd non-governmental funding out. And there have been a lot of instances when they've actually done so. When foundations got together and actually said for some specific purpose, we can put up, I don't know, 10 million euro, on comes the government and says, and we can do 500 million euro, because they have funding available at a scale that no philanthropy, no foundations can actually put up. And they use that to crowd foundations, to crowd philanthropy out, because they want to stay in the driver's seat. In many ways, they're no longer in the driver's seat anyway. We all realize this, we all know this, but government is sort of clinging on to this. So I don't think there's a climate there at the moment with governments to really cherish partnerships. There's one other argument I could use, and that is all this sort of citizen participation. I believe very strongly in citizen participation, but the way governments are doing it is to try and crowd out organized civil society and philanthropy, because they just collect citizens from somewhere, talk to them, have them discuss world problems with no sort of consequences whatsoever. And civil society, foundations who have the knowledge, who have the know-how, who can really contribute, are crowded out.
Thank you, Rupert. Timo.
Yes, thank you. I would in part second that, in part argue that it depends on the country. We see, for example, in Israel that there is a lot of cooperation between philanthropies and government. And another important angle is to look at the degree of cooperation, because if we speak about sharing information with each other, then it's quite easy. If we speak about creating joint service together, it's still possible. And if we speak about creating social change, then it becomes difficult. And this is some kind of a complex, or if we are in the realm of complex, wicked problems and stuff like that, then I think cooperation is very, very difficult to achieve. We have found some cases where it was tried quite well. Even in Germany, there is this partnership that was called Engagierte Stadt, which is in English, Engaged City. It was a partnership between 5 major foundations in Germany and also a government entity. And it was in part quite successful, I think. And it was also meant to fund civic engagement from an infrastructure perspective. And so I think it depends on where you look at and which degree of cooperation we are speaking about. And as I said, Israel is a good case for cross-sector collaboration. And we wrote an article about cross-sector collaboration, and I will share it with you.
Perfect. So there's another link that is going to come. And actually, Engagierte Stadt is still going on and was extended. So it actually underlines the success of that program. So I really want to come to the end and looking at time. So I'm going to do the one thing, like I'm going to ask every panelist my last favorite, my last famous question. So imagine you're sitting on your desk and suddenly next to your computer, there's a fairy. And you have one wish for philanthropy, for the future of philanthropy. So Rolf, what would be your wish for philanthropy?
Curiosity and courage. If we could inject a bit more of that into the philanthropic sector, I think it would be helpful.
Perfect, thank you. Erin, the fairy is on your desk at the Bosch Foundation.
Well, hopefully I would say that I would love to see more bigger gifts, longer term, more unrestricted, more flexible to more diverse grantees. So I think in one phrase, I try to pack in maybe more than one idea, but that would be my wish.
Thank you. Timo, the ferry is next to you now.
Okay, I think that it would be great to have more reliable data with regard to philanthropy.
Okay, great. Thank you. More reliable data. I think that's something many people would wish for. Hilary, now the ferry arrived in your red room. Actually, I know it's your kitchen. So
yeah, it's my kitchen. Imagination, just imagination. Foundations need to be more imaginative, and from that comes so much. It's a mindset change, yes, but certainly an ability to take risk. I think we've talked about curiosity and courage. From imagination will come those things. So that's what I wish.
Well, I thank everybody for the panelists for joining us today and spending their time with us in this discussion. I think it was very intense, and there are a lot of thoughts that I think should be pursued further, also in regards to the context of Germany, but also on an international level. So it's very great to have you all here. And Erin still is in Berlin, but Hilary, we will also get you to Berlin at one point, and maybe then also have a real life discussion one more time. And I also want to thank the audience that you all joined us here as part of this collaboration of Mäzenata Institute and Wieder Sense during the Berliner Stiftungswoche. So I'm really glad that you all came and listened in. And as mentioned, we also videotaped the session, so it also can be looked at some other time. So if you need to look at the references, and I more and more have a sense the chat function is turning into a bibliography. So that's kind of nice. So thank you very much to all of you. Still have a very nice day. And I hope we, in one way or another, will come back in some kind of a constellation like that to have an additional discussion on the future of philanthropy. Thank you.